Welcome to the SENDcast. My name is Dale Pickles and I'm the host of the SENDcast, and I'm also the managing director of B Squared, a company who supports schools to show the small steps of progress pupils with SEND make. If this is your first SENDcast, then welcome to the podcast. Each week on the podcast, we talk about a different topic within the world of special educational needs and disability, something to help us all learn and grow. In this episode, we're discussing identifying language needs in primary through screening. My guest this week is Angharad Welch. Angharad is a speech and language therapist who runs Find the Key Speech and Language Therapy. The SENDcast is created and produced by us here at B Squared. Everyone knows we help schools to show those small steps of progress pupils with SEND make, and we do this across a wide range of abilities and ages. But do you know about our Autism Progress Framework? It is our framework for help profiling a pupil's autism and how it impacts them. It is based on certs and looks at communication, social interaction, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. Autism Progress also includes a wide range of strategies to help support the pupils. Visit the B Squared website or click on the meeting link in the show notes to book a meeting with me to take you through Autism Progress and our assessment software and how it can help you. Now, let's get on with the podcast. On this week's podcast, we're discussing identifying language needs in primary through screening. My guest is Angharad Welch, a speech and language therapist who runs Find the Key Speech and Language Therapy. And Angharad works with schools and families providing support, training and advice. And Angharad has worked with a number of organisations like ELCLAN, NASON, and us here at B Squared, and she also speaks at various events. Welcome back, Angharad.
Hi, Dale.
You're back. It's been years.
It's been a really long time. How could you stay away from me? I don't know.
Just as you said, time flies and then you don't realise, do you?
It's true.
So today we're talking about screening for language difficulties. And my first question is, do many schools do this? And my second immediate question is, how many schools should be doing it?
So I think quite a lot of schools do some measure of screening, actually. Whether they're using the right tools and how effective they are is a slightly different question. But I think personally it should be a pretty routine thing in all primary schools. I can't really think of a reason you wouldn't language screen, whatever tool you end up using. But mostly I see people dashing around between tools looking for that perfect one. And so I think it's the implementation of screening that lets schools down a little bit, like so many things.
I remember being at a conference and it was a head teacher talking about, I think it was assessment tools. And he said, for 5 years, we are on our fourth or fifth assessment tool. And none of them have worked. And I sat down there and went, why? And he sat there and went, it's because we're not actually giving it a go. We kind of feel buying it is the solution. We've bought it. It will now magically work. And we didn't actually invest the time and effort into making it work. And he went, so the next year I just put the effort in and it worked perfectly. And looking back, I realized that any of those tools could have worked perfectly if we've just put the effort and the time in.
Yes, I think that is really common with any kind of speech and language tool, whether it's a screener or an intervention. 9 times out of 10, if you walk into the average school, you will see several million speech and language intervention books on the shelf, and they've all been abandoned because literally nobody even had time to read them, never mind implement them. And, mostly I'm a big believer in doing things imperfectly. So mostly things fall down because have not taken the time to implement and work through all the practicalities of them. And so I would really like people to use screeners. They're a great way to identify children, to intervene with children. But what I would really like people to take away from this session particularly is that your tool is only as good as your implementation and follow through. There isn't a magic screener out there. There isn't a magic intervention. There isn't one screen or one intervention to rule them all. It's just time and effort being put in, which we all know is the hardest resource in schools to find. So, but the fact is, every time you chuck 500 quid at an intervention or an assessment, that is hard-won money in your budget, isn't it? And so mostly, not always, because sometimes people I find in schools are using tools that aren't quite right for them, but mostly people have bought something and then aren't spending the time putting it into place and working the issue through. And it's usually because they're making last minute decisions at the end of the year. They suddenly have a bit of money left in their budget. They tend to make decisions about what they're buying based on a post in a Facebook group. I've done this too. Like, oh, does everybody like this one? And so that's where I think speech therapists really should be helping schools more with this kind of stuff, because we're the people with the kind of insight to support schools to choose the right tools for them. The needs of a big school, for example, are quite different from a small one and might imply a different tool choice. But also, schools don't always know which distinctions are important in terms of the data capture and that kind of thing, and what's going to make a difference to their language outcomes. And so I think one of the most valuable things I do, every year, is I do quite a lot of supporting schools implementing this stuff. You know, they buy in the tool and we do a little package of work just helping them implement it. And I think having somebody whose job it is to implement that screener, even it doesn't need necessarily to be a speech therapist, but it needs to be somebody's responsibility to work that thing through. And they need to have enough authority to do it as well. It's no good giving it to a teaching assistant if that teaching assistant doesn't feel they've got the authority to go, oi, this needs to happen.
I think that rule there goes, anything you're going to implement in a school, someone has to be leading it. You can't just implement it and go, here it is, like it's a sweet bowl in the staff room. That will sort itself out. It will get emptied very quickly. But nearly everything else, someone needs to be in charge of it to make sure it's happening and to make sure it's kind of people are using it and leading on it. I think that's for so many things, whereas I think they kind of buy it and they go, we've got that, cool. And then they can say, we're going to use this. And they've written in their school improvement plan, but no one leads on it. And I think that's really key, having that someone to lead on it.
Completely. And to be honest, now I've implemented screening in a few different schools, I think you need to give yourself like a whole school year as an absolute minimum. But really, I think we've been fine-tuning it in our schools now for a good 3 years. And I really feel like we've got it humming now. But it's taken a lot of detailed effort to kind of drill down into it and get the most out of these tools. And there's often tons you can do with the data and refining the interventions, but only if you spend the time understanding the setup of the system, understanding what the data means to you. So, you know, don't expect to these things are not a stick and plaster. No. And you have to be clear in your own mind about why you're doing them. A lot of people, you know, last year in particular, the reception intake for speech and language was very poor in a lot of schools. And so I got quite a lot of emails going, oh, what shall I buy? What shall I buy? And, you know, you have to be prepared to work these things through until they work in your school. And you have to be prepared to adapt the tool in front of you to your school a little bit as well and take some responsibility for that.
So in some ways, if you have a screening tool already, rather than actually buying one, it might be actually better to, however much you're going to spend on it, use that and supply time and come out of class for 2 days or however much it's going to cost you to really look at what you've got and learn about it and actually go, how are we going to use it, will be a better spender than money, because even if you bought a new one, you should be doing that anyway.
Yes, completely. Yeah, completely. I saw a lot of people over the pandemic, the government offered out Nelly for free, which is technically an intervention and not a screen. But I saw a lot of people abandon their existing tools for Nelly. Not that I've got no problem with Nelly, but, you know, abandon tools that were already working for them in many ways, and then just run into the same problems with Nelly because it's quite an intensive program to put in place. So yeah, absolutely. There is no getting around that you need to spend the time. And what I would say about tools is you get a lot of informal screeners often being used as part of the referral process by local NHS teams. And so sometimes you have to use them because it's part of your referral pathway. I personally favour, if you're going to have a screen and you're going to use it well, I would spend the money on something that comes with, it's got a nice robust screen and it links to an intervention package. So it's all seamless. What you don't want to do is spend a bit less money, get a screener that leaves you making a lot of the decisions and then still have to make intervention decisions at the end. So a lot of people try and save money, but another couple of £100 at the beginning will probably help you quite a lot down the line.
What's really important about this is that saving money is if it's giving you the interventions and you also follow those interventions as recommended, then that APDR cycle should be effective, or it's more likely to be effective than if you do the screening. You make a decision using a Facebook post or just doing some searching and finding some recommendation, not doing it in the recommended way. You're going to spend a lot longer going through the APDR cycle again and again and again, and it being completely ineffective, which in reality is costing you more money, costing you more time, rather than spending a little bit of money in the beginning to get that assessment, to get that intervention recommendation, and following the recommendations of frequency, time spent, and things like that of that intervention.
Yes, that's completely true. Definitely. Spend the money, use it well. Also, look at the interventions. Are you actually realistically going to be able to deliver on them?
Yes.
A lot of interventions would be great if you could do them every day. But if you genuinely know in your heart you can't do it, obviously there's lots to be said about funding and time spent on our children, of course. But if you know in your heart your setting cannot provide the recommended level, then what are you doing? You're diluting. There's this great word fidelity, isn't there, in the reading schemes that everybody's a bit obsessed with, maybe to the point of, flexibility. But somehow in speech and language interventions, that doesn't hold true, which I've never quite understood. We dilute the power of these tools by not using them in the way they were intended.
Yeah.
And then we think that that's the problem with the tool, but it wasn't.
I find with everyone's rushing to the doing. Grab an intervention, just do it, and it will have an impact. It's like, no. Finding the correct where the intervention is needed, then the planning, how often, how much, what is to get this working, what is it we're going to have to do. That is the planning part. And if you can't, as you said, do what it's recommending, it's probably going to be ineffective.
Absolutely. Or you won't know what worked and what didn't, or why it worked or why it didn't, And so one of the things I do in schools where I'm in regularly, my ideal scenario is that I've got somebody dedicated to deliver all the interventions that come off the back of the screening. And where that's the case, we spend good, maybe a half day, a term going through all the data, looking at what's worked, what hasn't, and we always comment on that, from the outside, it probably looks like we're just sat there drinking tea, but that is what makes it effective. And it needs an extraordinary amount of time to go through all that data and kind of work through on an individual level what's working and what's not, and adapting. And it also takes a certain amount of confidence as well. And I think that's why, as a speech therapist, I probably have that easier than people making decisions off that data, because I can go, well, I've got the clinical background to prioritize. If we've got child with X profile, child with X, another profile, well, I think we've got X amount of time to intervene. This is going to be the most effective use of the time. Now, I appreciate that not everybody can do that.
But I would argue, that's the sort of thing is, someone go, I don't have half a day. We cannot. But I'm happy to spend the next 2 terms wasting an hour a day doing something which isn't working well because I'm not doing it the correct way. That adds up to much more than half a day.
Yes.
And also, in that half a day, we can change what we're doing, understand the importance of doing it that way, get that embedded in half a term or a term. Oh, look, we've already moved on. And I know I'm really simplifying the process. I get that. But in reality, it is that kind of way.
Yeah.
Doing it right the first way. I'm going to use fair economy, as the advert used to say. Remember those adverts?
No.
Sorry. Oh, fairy washing up liquid. They always had that one bottle, and they were saying, although it's more expensive, it lasts so much longer. So if you buy the right tool for the job, it'll be much more effective than buying just that cheaper version, which looks cheaper. But it's that sort of thing. It's certain things you buy right, you do right, and it works.
Yes. I do know how excruciatingly difficult that is in school, because I do understand that I'm in a privileged position and I only need to worry about the speech and language.
Yes.
So if I spend half a day on my speech and language data, that's a good use of my time, and that's what lets me be effective. But I do understand you've also got data and decisions to make about everything else. So I don't say this stuff lightly, but I think it's usually the missing piece for schools is the time spent getting to grips with the intervention. Sometimes, and this is by no means a plug for buying in speech therapy, but sometimes you are best spent buying in a bit of expertise who can just make quicker decisions off your data for you as well. Often it doesn't need a lot of time. Somebody who's more familiar with the tool than you are, who can just cut to the chase really in terms of helping you interpret it. can be worth the money as well. So, don't, by all means, when you're buying screens, they have, generally speaking, if you're buying a decent screener, they have everything you need to make the decisions, look at the data going forward. But, sometimes there's a payoff in terms of time and outcomes and things. So sometimes just buying in a little outside time to help you get something implemented or look at the data with you even once a year and go, right, this is what I do. This is who I'd refer. This is what I do with this cohort, is time well spent. A couple of hours of external time if somebody knows what they're doing with the tool can really save you money and time in the long run.
And some of that money and time can be, you already have the evidence clearly there for EHCPs and things like that, rather than not doing it correctly and having to spend more time. And it is spending that less time at the beginning, which you may not think you need, can save you so much more time later on.
I say this as somebody who does not find, I'm not a very detail-oriented person myself. I find that quite difficult. It's a bit boring, isn't it? Once the shiny object syndrome has passed away, you still have to do the work. But I tell you what, it's a really good feeling a year or two down the line when you see your data. It's a really, really good feeling. And I feel very comfortable knowing that because we've implemented our screen well, we've got good decisions made and we've got good defensible data and profiles in place. So when inspectors come, people understand why they're doing the things they're doing. They understand where we're being effective. We can clearly identify where we're not being effective, which is difficult conversations to have sometimes, but it means I can go back to the SENCO or SLT and say, look, you're not being effective here because we are consistently not being effective with this group of children because, you can pass those decisions up the line. But otherwise, I feel there's a lot of, I just feel like this isn't working.
But I don't know why.
Yes, I don't know exactly why. And, it comes down then to strength of emotion and personal clout when you're making decisions, which is, as a speech therapist, I don't love a lot of data taking. Sorry, that's hard to say. But actually, it really helps people make effective decisions with SLT and effective arguments.
I think sometimes is when you're not doing that intervention how you should, it's going to be less effective. And then people start going, well, there's no point doing speech and language interventions because they're not effective. And you're then fighting that whole mentality of why bother, because it doesn't work. And it is, you really do, with going back to the beginning, you have to put the effort in to make it work. And you may see an improvement after a couple of months, but it's more likely going to be a snowballing thing that in reality you will not see the full benefit for 3 years. But it is throughout that 3-year time, it's reviewing and improving and checking and going through, and you will see improvements over 3 years. Huge. But you have to be on that. You have to be committed to doing that.
You also have to be prepared that there are decisions to be made during that time about where you put your focus, because there are bits of the data I'm not addressing because we've made decisions. We've got X amount of time. You've got X amount of speech therapist time. These are where your big problems are. And there are things we're not focusing on right now. And you have to be prepared to, that's not very nice because these are children we're talking about. And I think sometimes ineffective intervention comes off trying to do a little bit of everything. And sometimes we're better off picking off, so your screener might tell you that you've got a particular issue with listening and attention, or a particular issue with particular concepts, for example. And you might be better off picking off a project around that and knowing that right now you're not necessarily doing so much to address something else. And you have to be comfortable with that and able to defend that. And you also need the people above you to be prepared to defend you too, because there's always somebody in school to tell you what you're not doing. And you need to be sure that somebody's got your back, because you can't possibly improve all your speech and language at the same time. You just can't do it.
Definitely. So, you go.
No, I was just saying so much of the implementation is kind of an emotional and cultural thing, isn't it? It's about people feeling safe to say it's not working, this is working, this isn't working, I need more time. And to have the trust from the people above you that you're using that time well and that will pay off. I find in schools, I think partly as a result of the APDL cycle, actually, people have this very unrealistic expectation that if it doesn't work in 6 weeks, it's not working. And I think that sort of accidentally gets translated into everything else in schools too. The rest of reality does not work in 12-week terms. And so people make, if I went to the gym for 12 weeks, I'd be a bit better off, but I haven't changed my life outcome, have I? It's years and years of cumulative impact of that, good intervention, good quality work that makes the difference to your life outcomes. And that's what we're talking about with these children. It's life outcomes. I know that we are operating on, can I evidence to somebody that I'm doing something? But actually, the reason screening is important is because we know that children have poor life outcomes when we don't identify and support them. So we have to just change our horizon on this stuff and not panic and just control our own emotions around this stuff and go, right, I've put this thing in. Oh, goodness me, it's 6 weeks down the line. It's not working yet. You need to feel safe in yourself to kind of carry on.
And if after 6 weeks, it's not working, go back to what are the recommendations and what are you doing? That's the one thing that actually maybe reviewing it after it's not working. It's like, you're supposed to do this 1 hour a day. Cool. When are you doing it? Right after lunch. Should we change the time?
Yes.
Should we do it in the morning? Should we do it at this time? That's the thing, is sometimes it's not what you're doing. It's when.
Yeah.
That might be the issue. And that might be your issue because you're on lunch duty, you come in and you've not had a break. So you're not in the best place and you're really focused on the intervention, or it might be the child. But there are lots of factors. And I do think it's worth kind of reviewing, but it's not changing everything. It's going, what's the recommendation?
Yes.
If everyone else is saying this is working, why isn't it working for us? What's the reason?
Yes, it's iterating, not changing.
Yes.
That's the thing. For sure. For example, as an example of that, our SALT assistant in one of my schools, she was delivering some interventions. They weren't being very effective. I knew she was doing them as often as I'd recommended. She tended to work with the early years children in early years because the room she generally works is just physically far away from early years. And you can imagine it just takes a long time to get small children to a room.
Oh, yes.
So she was working in early years. And when we sat and talked about it and looked at the data, well, actually, I said, it's worth the time to take those children to that quieter room. You might have a 5-minute session when you get there, but it'll be an effective session where they're not distracted. And that was enough to shift the outcome. They started shifting then. And, it's small tweaks like that.
Yes.
But she didn't feel confident to do that because, it's easier for me to say I've got a bit more authority as a speech therapist and I'm not a direct member of staff in quite the same way. So if somebody questions, why are you spending half your day traipsing children up and down your corridor? Well, it's actually because they cannot focus in the busier environment. And what's going to make this intervention effective is to have shorter sessions, but in a quieter place. And that's the size of things you're talking about.
Yeah. That's the thing, when something's not working, it's is it a frequency, is actually distraction, so many things. So somebody was telling me that they always did this intervention, but they did it near the school hall just before lunch when all the cooking smells. So everyone was distracted because they were going, oh, lunch. Lack of concentration. Change room, change time, much more concentration.
Absolutely. And in schools, a classic thing is not, I'm wandering off screening here now. We're talking about implementing interventions, but absolute classic thing is nobody wants the children out of phonics. And, as a speech therapist, I'm constantly advocating that if you want the children's literacy to improve, you need their speech and language to improve. And so everybody wants the children seen, but none of them want the children seen in the morning.
Yes.
And the maths just doesn't math, basically. And so there have to be compromises. And again, this is where your data can back you up, because you can say, look, this is how far behind they are. They're not coming on with their phonics because this is where they're at with their language, or yes, their decoding is improving, but their comprehension of what they're reading is not, because you're not addressing their language needs. And how I know is I have this data over time because I have this amazing screening tool that I've implemented properly. So all these help you make good core arguments, and you're not always going to win. Your thing is not always going to be the priority, but you're not going in there being like, I'm just this nice SEN person who feels like we should. You're going in there with some solid background. And because everybody thinks speech and language intervention is a good idea until they need to take a member of staff to cover lunch. That's the truth of it, And so your intervention time is extremely vulnerable to all the stuff that goes on in school. And you can't, unless you have an immense amount of personal authority in your school, you need data to help you. And sometimes that means acknowledging where we failed. And certainly in my schools, that's helped us get a SALT assistant, because over a couple of years I went, look, you're not doing very well on your screening data because you're not getting the interventions done because you don't have dedicated time. And that, now I had to, that doesn't feel great as a speech therapist going, oh, look, 2 years of failure, but that's what helped us get the third year where we've got loads of good data and we're getting great outcomes now. And so, but it takes a lot of confidence to do that. And you're spending a lot of personal capital every time you kind of go in there and go, look how badly we're failing at this.
But we shouldn't be scared. It's like you haven't failed. You just found another way which doesn't work. And it is that fine tuning. It's revising and going, okay, so he needs it. But generally, when you fail, you should always learn something.
Yeah.
Every time you fail, I've got a lovely scar on my chin. It taught me never to take my feet off the pedals on my bike. So I didn't. But that's the sort of thing. When you fail, you learn. So it's not, a fail isn't just a complete, it doesn't work. Generally, you learn something from it. So failing isn't always complete waste of time. You generally don't make that same mistake again, hopefully.
Yes. I mean, a lot of times when it comes to speech and language intervention, when we fail, it usually means that somebody didn't do what I asked them to the first time, if I'm honest. How dare people have other priorities apart from speech and language?
So, bringing back to screeners.
Yeah.
Now, you're going to give us the only list that anyone ever needs to know. From your experience,
yeah,
what screeners work well?
Okay, so there's a few main players in the screener world. A big one is Language Link, which is a very detailed, and again, links to the intervention. So I'm only going to tell you things that link to an intervention. It's very detailed. It's relatively expensive compared to some of the other tools. I think you have to look at it quite carefully, because if it's right for your school, it's perfect. It's very detailed, a tool with a lot of content in it. But I don't think it's right for every school. In where I live, we have a lot of small village schools who I don't think can always make the most out of very detailed screeners. They don't have the time commitment. So I would definitely have a look. They will let you have a free trial of that one. So Language Link is a big one. Wellcom is my personal favourite. I implement that a lot. And what I like about Wellcom personally is that it's got a certain amount of flexibility in how you put in place the interventions. Again, because it means your screening process is robust. You're not making biased decisions about who you're worried about. But then there's a certain amount of flexibility in how you choose to group the children, whether you choose to do one-to-one. You can do whole cohort stuff in the classroom. There's quite a lot of different ways you can address the targets there. And then the new player on the stage, who I don't know a lot about, but it's come around because it's basically a precursor to the Nelly. So a lot of the schools did the Nelly because it was freely available to them during the pandemic. And so the Oxford language screen has come out as a kind of pre-screen for the Nelly. It's not one I know so well, but again, same principle. You screen robustly and then there's an intervention that comes off the back of it. So those are the main players, I would say. I do think there's a little bit of room for, sometimes with my smaller schools, actually they have speech therapy led screening where we do our own screening tools, which in some ways is not as systematic, because obviously it's open to therapist bias. But sometimes for the smaller schools, the cost trade-off is worth having a therapist in to do our own screening. That's the other thing. So this is what I mean. If you're looking at buying in any outside therapy time, a therapist should be helping you make that decision about what tool is right for you, and what, and not based on their own interests about how much work they're going to get, but just like what's the right tool for your school and your situation.
And sometimes that is going to be biased based on the ones they've seen work well in other schools. So they're not going to give you the best one, because there is no ultimate best one. It's the ones that you've seen work effectively in different schools. And that's what you're looking for, is the effectiveness.
Completely. I mean, I will always say I'm just most familiar with the Wellcom. So I'm not saying it's the perfect tool. In fact, the perfect tool does definitely not exist. They all have their weaknesses. They can all get false positives and false negatives for sure. So, the other thing I would say about screeners is, having said all this about, I like a screener because you're not open to people's opinions about what normal speech and language looks like, because if you're in an area where it's got a lot of speech and language needs, you get very accommodated to seeing low language levels. So it doesn't leave you open to, well, I don't think there's a problem, or oh, I know that family and none of them talk to them at 5 or whatever. So, which kind of creeps in. But on the flip side of that, there are children who do quite well on a screen and you think something's not right there, though. And so I wouldn't want people to think a screen should override their gut instinct about children either, because they're not perfect and they are not looking at absolutely everything about communication either. So I'm talking about language screening here. There are also speech screens available, speech sound screens. But they don't tend to address social communication. So, you can have a child who does really well on a language screen, but you're thinking their social communication is not doing okay. So, don't let the fact that you spent 500 quid on a tool override your judgment either. So it's more, it's a bit of art and science.
So at the beginning, you talked about that time learning the system and implementing it and things like that. So for those three you mentioned, what is their kind of, I'm going to say the word onboarding, but that kind of helping you once you get it is like, here's your product, buy. What's that kind of after sales support? What's that kind of hand holding, guidance? Are those three good for that?
That's a good question. I'm not as familiar with the Oxford language screen, so I'm not sure about that. The Language Link has a high level of ongoing support with it. That's partly why it's a slightly more expensive package, really. The Welcome, you don't get a lot of ongoing support with it. So, these are trade-offs basically in terms of the cost. And so again, that's why sometimes a school might buy in somebody like me to help them out a little bit with a tool if they've gotten a bit stuck. So yeah, that's reflected in the cost of those. So I would say Language Link has got a high level of ongoing.
Because it's one of the things we found. We've had schools who would buy our assessment software, and then a year and a bit later they would cancel. And you're like, what? And sometimes, people cancel because the children have moved on or things like that. But other times, what we've worked out is, although we've got stuff they can access, they kind of felt a bit lost. So we're doing a much more proactive role now with kind of following up and account managers and inviting for meetings. We're doing a much more hand holding because we're finding doing that at the beginning makes it much more effective. It's not going to be a product they buy and sit on the shelf and then it's done. Is we're finding that putting that investment of our time with them in the beginning means that tool is going to be much more effective. So it might be that Speech Language Link is more expensive, but if in reality, if you're starting off and you're not quite sure and you get that much more support and guidance, it's going to be more effective. Or use your speech and language therapist to help you.
Yes.
It's about not just having it, going about the beginning, implementing, embedding, and getting the most out of it is the bit you need to do.
Yes, definitely. And just to mention, Language Link also has training, which Welcome does not have. So it has like a training portal. So again, I mean, you're weighing up cost and support and time. So, and what resources are there. I find sometimes people buy things that are very detailed and then they get so overwhelmed by how much is in there that they never use any of it. It's a bit of it's difficult, isn't it, to get the balance right, like you said.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, or you might buy something which is cheaper, but you then look at it and go, I don't know how to use this, and the support options aren't available. Whereas that so basically you haven't bought a cheaper one, you have literally wasted that money because you're probably going to buy something else now.
Yes.
And it is going back to that fair economy type stuff, but it is that, what is the overall cost? What is the impact? And I know with budgets, you can get very much caught on the number. That number we're buying, so, well, this one's cheaper, let's just buy that one. You're like, but actually, which one is going to be effective? Which one is going to make a difference? That's what we're looking for. And if spending that bit more means you get that training, you get that onboarding, you get people you can talk to, so you're 100% confident going forward, that is, and I know money is tight, but it's money well spent because you haven't just thrown that money away.
Yeah, that's definitely true. A good example of that is I had a school approach me about putting in place some screening, and we talked about Welcome in this particular case. And I had kind of forgotten that a digital version of WorldCom's come out recently where you can do the whole thing online as opposed to a bit of a hybrid. And so when I went there, I was kind of set up for implementing the physical version. And I thought it was really interesting, actually. It's such a good example of what you're talking about. The person who'd bought the product had looked at the digital one, it was cheaper, so they'd bought that. And then when I went to train the TAs on how to implement it, they said, well, digital's not going to work for us because, we all know we can't get a laptop and we can't actually connect to the internet and all that kind of stuff. And in the end, the school ended up buying the physical version because actually the TAs were like, yeah, but for the sake of another, however much it was, £100 or whatever, I can actually use this as opposed to spending half an hour trying to connect to the internet and then giving up. And that's, you have to talk to your teams before you're putting stuff in place. So often these things get imposed on teams.
Yeah.
And you have to spend a bit of time laying the groundwork because, there's nothing like delivering an inset in September to a team who didn't know you were coming. And somebody in SLT thought this thing you were coming to tell them about and implement it was a really good idea. But nobody's got anybody on board, And so that is really important with screening, as with anything else. The human factor, because what makes things work is humans. We can put as much online as we like, but ultimately it's humans seeing the relevance of things and deciding it's important. That's what makes stuff happen in schools.
Yes. And every single school, even a brand new school after the first year, will have a cupboard or a bookshelf with stuff they have bought that no one's using.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not because it's ineffective. It's because it either wasn't understood, the time wasn't there, or it was bought on a recommendation which doesn't fit in with their way of doing things.
Yes.
So when you're deciding about spending maybe that one or the slightly more expensive one, go to that cupboard, look at all of that stuff and ask yourself, if I buy the cheaper one, is it going to end up in here?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, look at what's gathering most dust.
Because sometimes I've had so many people go, look in that cupboard. And I think it was Carol Anna was saying, just go through the cupboard, work out what everything is, and you can probably find a load of stuff in there. It works amazingly well, but you're investing time to find out. But that sort of thing, it is spending smarter. It's all about spending smarter. And sometimes the more expensive option is the right one, but sometimes simplicity is also key.
Yes.
And
that's
sometimes
true.
A paper version, as you said, I know with us, I spent years trying to get teachers to drop paper because it's so much quicker to do it digitally. There's always a reason. So I've given up fighting, and you can print out sheets to record on them, things like that, and then put it back into the software because it works that way in some schools. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, do you want the outcome you want, or do you want everybody to do it the same? I mean, this is...
Outcomes, always outcomes.
It's always about outcomes, isn't it? And for me, putting in place a screener is about laying the foundations. What I would like people to do with their speech and language in schools is just be much more systematic about how they're approaching things. Schools tend to, and this is not a criticism, it's just human behavior, but schools tend to go, oh, everybody seems to be doing colourful semantics. Let's do colourful semantics. Oh, everybody's doing, whatever the latest thing is. And, not that those things don't have value, but they don't understand why they're adding value and they don't understand where their priorities lie. And so as a speech therapist, apart from working with individual children, the thing I really enjoy doing is putting things in place in schools that I know are going to help them build a system where one thing feeds into the next thing. The screener tells you the intervention outcomes tells you whether you need a more specialist intervention. The data tells you, do I need a more frequent session there, or do I need to involve a more specialist person? One thing leads to another, not this kind of scattergun, somebody said this one was good, so now we're doing this.
And that thing, sometimes people chasing those improvements will change things every year because it's the latest, it's the fashion, it must work. And one of our team has two daughters in the same school, a couple of years apart. They did one phonics with the eldest, came to the youngest, and now it's like, I don't understand how to teach them phonics at home or how we should be doing it. It makes no sense to me because it's a completely different scheme. So it's that wider impact when you're changing something. It's not just looking at that in isolation. It's looking at from where we were to where we're going and the wider impact of that in the school.
Yeah, that's it. I know it sounds a bit woolly, but I quite often talk to people about, what is your vision for your speech and language in your school? Because if you're not fixed on something in the future, you have no clue how to get there, do you? You're just kind of, drifting around in the wind. And, when when you're doing your home visits before they come in reception, the panic sets in. We need to do something different in September. And it's not the time. It's like anything, I personally try not to make decisions when I'm like too tired or hungry or too emotional. And it's really easy to get swept away by whatever the latest thing is. And the truth is, if you look at the detail of most speech and language interventions, we've got a lot more of an evidence base than we ever have, which is brilliant. It's hard to make generic statements about how much speech therapy is enough. The populations we've got studies on tend to be quite discrete, teenagers with DLD or primary school children with Down syndrome. And it's hard to extrapolate kind of big picture conclusions from these things. But if you actually look at the detail of most speech and language interventions, however they're packaged, they're not terribly different from each other, not really. And for me, I would rather people do the thing that isn't perfect but be consistent and then tweak the content later than, sit around worrying about, well, there's this one speech therapy thing that's going to make all the difference. What I do in therapy mostly, not always, is pretty similar stuff, actually. And what I do as a speech therapist is I'm just there to concentrate on that. And I'm not getting thrown by other things. I'm not getting thrown by, behavior or whatever's gone on in the classroom that day. It's just my job to focus on that. And often it's the focus that makes it effective.
There is a phrase or a saying which, first time I read it, I was like, what the hell? That makes no sense. And the phrase is, anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
Yes.
Which sounds like you can just do it badly. And I'm like, that makes no sense. But basically what you're saying is you won't get it right at the start, but the whole thing about it is improving. And the aim is to get to doing it perfectly. But you're not going to be perfect from the beginning, so don't hugely worry. So it might be 2 years worth of failing, but giving it a go and learning and then getting it right from year 3 onwards.
Yes. I find with a lot of interventions, imperfect but consistent will still actually shift quite a lot of things forward. And then you'll soon find out the children who actually need perfect intervention to move them forward. But, when you weren't doing anything for fear of getting it wrong, then nobody was moving forward. So,
Yes.
There are children who will come forward with a bit of extra speech and language intervention almost regardless of what it is. And what a screen can help you do is identify who those children are and pile in that what's going to move them forward, and then quickly identify the children who definitely need something very specific. So I think, obviously what goes on in therapy sessions is very important, but most important is turning up. I mean, that's basically true of life, isn't it? Turning up is 90% of it, really.
Yes. One of the is a podcast after the release of this a couple of months later. One of the things we talk about is zones of regulation and is it effective, blah, blah, blah. One of the things we touched on, it's not necessarily what you're doing, it's how much effort you're putting into it. So as you said, imperfect regularly or imperfect on that recommended frequency is going to have an impact opposed to doing it perfectly less frequently.
Yes.
It's the frequency, it's the time spent, not the time spent doing it perfectly.
Yes. And also, I wish people, with anything, zones of regulations are a classic, actually. I wish people spent the time they spent making the resources and putting the display board together on reading the book and implementing it.
Yes.
Because I see many a beautiful, I like zones of regulation, anything like that is great, but, I see many a very beautiful display board. And then when you ask the child, like, anything about that system, they don't have a clue what you're talking about.
No. So, yeah, sneak peek, in a couple of months, there's an episode coming all about zones of regulation. It's all about emotional regulation with Kerry Talia. So listen out for that, listeners. It's coming.
That sounds good. Yeah.
It's a fun one, but yeah. Cool. Is there anything we haven't covered?
I would just like to briefly say a word about screening and EAL.
Oh, yes.
That's a question I get a lot. So in an ideal world, you'd have a screener that screens children in their home language as well. And by in their home language, I don't mean a translated version of your English screener.
Yes.
So that would be the ideal. I'm not sure in reality this has ever existed. I mean, the tools around EAL are very lacking. I mean, they are coming through, but there are massive gaps in what's available commercially. For speech and language, secondary is a big one and EAL is another. So, but I do think there's still value in screening your EAL children. The big question to ask yourself is, how long have they been exposed to English for? Sometimes, personally, this is just a decision I've made, kind of weighing up evidence really for my schools. If children are really genuinely brand new to English, I don't see much purpose in screening them. They're not going to do very well, and that won't tell you anything. What we tend to do is have them in school for a term, maybe a term and a half, and then screen them to get a sense of kind of, are they picking things up? What I wouldn't do is kind of trust the results to be indicative necessarily of an ongoing disorder at that point, but they can tell you where some gaps are. They might tell you where to enrich their language opportunities. So I think there is value in screening children with EAL, but you can't treat the results quite as solidly. The other thing is finding out from parents their own kind of family history. What's their home language like? Are there concerns there? And getting a good, robust history. Personally, I think there is a bit of a risk of over-identifying EAL children on the screens. But for me personally, and this is genuinely a personal thing, I would almost rather that than the opposite, which is what I see is children maybe getting to year 6, they're EAL, but they've been here for years and years and years and years, and nobody's noticed they've got a language disorder. And so, you have to use screening tools a bit more judiciously with EAL. But there is still value in them. But just this is when, they're not perfect. You do have to have a little bit of a judgment call about the results sometimes. But that's always something that people ask. So I just wanted to mention that.
Cool. I noticed that. I was reading on, you have a blog about screening and schools, and I noticed the EAL was on there. So,
yeah, people always ask, but just don't forget that your children who are EAL can also have language disorder.
Yes. So thank you for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
Angharad's given me a number of links. So she mentioned 3 screeners, so links to them. There's also links to her Facebook page, her website, her email, her Twitter. And if you go to the website, that's where you'll find the blog that I just mentioned. And as always, you'll find the show notes wherever you listen to the podcast or on the website. So thank you for listening to the show. If you are not following us on social media, please start following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. It's all the SENDcast, and I think it's the SENDcast as well on TikTok, which is new for us. And the SENDcast is created and produced by us here at B Squared. We help to show the small steps of progress pupils with SEND make. But did you know about Autism Progress? This is our framework for helping to profile a pupil's autism and how it impacts them. It's based on certs and looks at communication, social interaction, emotional regulation, and flexible thinking. And Autism Progress also includes a wide range of strategies to help support the pupils. Visit the B Squared website or click on the meeting link in the show notes to book a meeting with me to take you through our assessment software and how it can help you. So thank you for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the SENDcast. It is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Bye, everyone.